is brought to you by Modelo.
From his early rise as the king of the Miami streets to his emergence as one of the biggest stars in the sport, the story of Jorge Masvidal has been unique by any metric. But that doesn't mean that Gamebred hasn't had to deal with his own fair share of controversy. And with that in mind, here are some of his most controversial moments. Fighters are often elevated to the status of role models, both in their home community and to the wider world. And while this label certainly applies to Jorge Masvidal, he doesn't always set the best example. But we're not trying to take shots. The man is an icon to many of his fellow Miami natives, a guy who can be pointed to as proof of the merits of hard work and dedication. But when push comes to shove, and let's face it, it often does, Jorge makes zero efforts to hide from his roots as a street fighter. He'll play nice for the cameras on occasion, but if he feels threatened or slighted by someone in the room, you'd best believe that he's going to make a beeline. Jorge shot to fame years ago after appearing in a number of viral street fighting videos that also featured the legendary Kimbo Slice. These battles were wild, unsanctioned brawls that often saw Jorge matched up with much bigger opposition. And when he did eventually transition over to MMA, he already had a name behind him. The first moment of controversy came when Jorge was tasked with taking on the great Donald Cerrone. The fight was a major opportunity for Jorge to steal the momentum of a guy who was quickly establishing himself as a dark horse within the welterweight mix. Cerrone was on one hell of a win streak, but when he ran into this rejuvenated 170-pound version of Masvidal, things took a turn for the ugly. Now, we'll point out that this was in no way Masvidal's fault, but after turning up the heat on Cowboy towards the end of the first round, Jorge rained down with a barrage of strikes that should have resulted in a TKO finish. Instead, the referee, Herb Dean, was merely breaking them up for the end of the round. So, Jorge was forced to go out there and TKO the clearly beaten Cerrone for a second time. Again, Jorge did what he had to do, but this was unquestionably a controversial finish. Okay, let's get into the good stuff. UFC London in 2019 was a mixed bag of results for British fighters. On one hand, the future welterweight champion Leon Edwards had managed to win in highly impressive fashion, beating Gunnar Nelson by decision. But one of the brightest prospects in British MMA, Darren Till, had fallen victim to a brutal KO defeat at the hands of none other than Jorge Masvidal. And boy, was it a bad knockout. But the real headline would come when Masvidal scored his second win. Yeah, you heard us right. While being interviewed, Jorge noticed that Edwards was jawing at him off screen. Instead of trying to settle the situation and continue his chat with the media, Jorge stopped what he was doing, walked over to Leon with his hands behind his back, and promptly smacked him with multiple quick punches. It was an ugly scene, sure, but it was also a viral star-making moment. And with that, the three-piece and the soda was born. However, this wouldn't be the last time that Masvidal took out some vengeance on someone who had wronged him. When Jorge came face-to-face with Ben Askren, these two had a beef that could only be settled one way. The personality clash between the two was very dramatic, and you could just tell that they were both clamoring for their opportunity to fight. Unfortunately for Ben, when the fighting started, it didn't last very long. Jorge had a secret weapon. He knew that Askren would shoot in for the takedown, and when he did, he would be met with a flying knee from hell. But that wasn't the controversial bit. No, the really unsettling part about this came when Jorge decided to follow up that devastating knee with a pair of super necessary follow-up shots. Askren was already stiffening, already out cold, and yet Jorge decided to add two massive punches for good measure. And he knew exactly what he was doing. Sure, they had some beef that was clearly played up for the cameras, but this was legitimately dangerous behavior. Not all controversies need to be violent, though. And when it came to the clash between Jorge Masvidal and Nate Diaz, the UFC opted to make a move that they may never even attempt again. Look, Jorge and Nate are two legitimate fan favorites, two guys who have turned long careers into the most unlikely of mainstream breakthroughs. In other words, these guys have been around the fight game long enough to really deserve all of their rewards. But here's where things get dicey. Neither man has truly been a top 5 fighter in their division for any longer than a brief spell. Nate fought for UFC lightweight gold, and Jorge was hanging around the top levels at 170 pounds but lost to most of the elites. But the UFC decided to create a fake belt, the BMF title, for these non-championship level fighters to compete for. And they would have Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson present it. In the end, the whole thing came off as a cash grab, gimmicky, and a bit trashy for the sport. Jorge won, and it was a legit win. But in truth, the victory itself should have been enough. From there, Jorge attracted more controversy when he gave back-to-back title shots against Kamaru Usman. And sure, he took that first fight on short notice, but he was dominated by the champion in there. It just wasn't even slightly competitive. But because of that gesture, the UFC decided to give him another title shot directly afterwards. And boy, did it backfire. Instead of a slow, tactical performance from Usman, this time he came to the cage with supreme confidence. Confidence he used to nail Jorge on the feet with one of the biggest punches you are ever going to see. It was like something out of a Rocky movie. All of a sudden, Masvidal was on a 2-fight skid, and things didn't get any better when he lost to Colby Covington shortly after. These two were once great friends, but their relationship soured, and it all culminated in a 5-round battle inside the cage that Colby won. Or at least that's where it should have finished. Despite having failed to get the win, Masvidal couldn't just call it quits with Colby. Instead, he figured out Covington's location after the former UFC interim champion posted an Instagram story from a Miami restaurant. Jorge then made his way over to this restaurant and proceeded to sucker punch his former friend as he left the establishment. He caused damage to Colby's teeth and an expensive watch he owned. If there were any doubts left over the legitimacy of this beef, well, Jorge pretty decisively put it here. After all, we all know that Masvidal is from a background where sucker punching is pretty common. And in recent years, he has a better track record against the top 5 welterweights on the street than he does in the octagon. Just ask Leon Edwards and Colby. But despite getting dragged into a legal battle that stretched into 2023, Jorge made one more walk to the cage. His retirement fight against Gilbert Burns. And believe it or not, he had one final slice of controversy to bring to us. If you know anything about Jorge, you'll know that he has modeled himself as a modern-day Scarface. Unfortunately, that got him into some trouble during the build-up to his final fight. During some of the promo material for UFC 287, Jorge invited a camera crew into his house to give a behind-the-scenes look at his life. What that crew didn't expect was that Jorge was about to put their lives in danger. Okay, we're being a little dramatic, but to put it simply, Masvidal caught some heat for showing off one of his guns and pointing it in the direction of one of the crew. Sure, nothing happened, but the idea of treating every gun like it's potentially loaded clearly never got to Jorge Masvidal. The move was criticized for being reckless, leaving Masvidal's final fight week with yet another controversy to navigate. But with his fighting career now over, you can't say that Jorge didn't always keep things interesting, even to the very end. From his legendary 3-piece and a soda order to that one feud that just got a little bit too personal. Watching Jorge Masvidal over the years has given us no shortage of majorly controversial moments.